My guest today is Professor Christine Webb, who's assistant professor at NYU, where she is part of the Animal Studies program. Her research focuses on the social behavior, cognition, and emotion of non-human primates. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so we want to talk about your latest book, The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. So before we get into the details of this, Christine, do you want to sort of set the context? What is the book about?
Sure. Yeah, and it's my first book, and it grew out of a course that I taught at Harvard for a number of years of the same name, The Arrogant Ape. And the main argument of the book is that human exceptionalism, this belief that humans are separate from and superior to the rest of life on Earth, is at the root of the ecological crisis. And I use the phrase at the root very deliberately because I think root systems are complex and they rarely have one dominant node. Rather, all the different roots, reinforce one another and connect to one another. So I don't think it's the only cause of the ecological crisis, but I think it's a really important one that often doesn't get named and identified, at least in the mainstream climate discourse. And then another sub-theme of the book is that this ideology of human exceptionalism has infiltrated the sciences and thus the way we come to understand humans' place in nature.
Yeah, so the chapter 1 is entitled The Human Superiority Complex.
Yeah.
Is what you mean by exceptionalism is the same as human superiority or something different?
It is a bit different. So I use the term human exceptionalism instead of human supremacy or human uniqueness to clarify an important distinction, because people have been asking, okay, but don't you think humans are unique in some ways, right? Don't we do things where, after all, sitting here having a conversation on computers over a podcast, I don't think other species are doing that. And so it's important to clarify up front what I don't mean by human exceptionalism, which is that humans are not, unique in any way. It's possible that humans are unique in some ways, though I would at least note that historically attempts to define what that is have either included members of other species or excluded an array of human beings, often those already discriminated against in our society by some way. But human exceptionalism is different from human uniqueness. So human exceptionalism suggests that what is distinctive about humans is somehow more advanced or morally worthy than the distinctive features of other forms of life. And so I like human exceptionalism because I think it combines elements of both human supremacy and human uniqueness, because it suggests that what's unique about humans is better than the unique features that all forms of life may be said to have.
And you also call it anthropocentrism. And that does make sense. I mean, we humans think they're really great. Most humans, at least, we got 8 billion of them now. But we have been exceptionally successful, I would say. Maybe a few 100,000 years. We have colonized the entire world, so we have been exceptionally successful. I'm also fond of saying Homo sapiens are very efficient killing machines. So as they progress, they basically eliminated any other Homo species on Earth as well.
Right.
And so this idea that we are special has been with us right from the beginning, it looks like, right?
Well, I mean, I think this idea of, okay, first of all, what does it mean to be evolutionarily successful is something you hear a lot, that humans are the most successful species on Earth, indeed, because we've managed to inhabit all of these different parts of the globe. And I would equate that more with ecological dominance or evolution. We have achieved a certain ecological dominance in this, remarkable ability to manipulate and control our environments. But whether we should call that successful or not from an evolutionary perspective, especially, if you're interested in other metrics like longevity, right? We've been around for 200,000 years, whereas other species have been around for millions. So I think I like to kind of trouble that notion of what does it mean to be evolutionarily successful. And this idea or this possibility that the idea of human exceptionalism has been with us from the start of Homo sapiens, I would not necessarily subscribe to. I think there's so much variation within Homo sapiens around how we relate to the environment and whether we exploit the environment or live in relative coexistence with it. I don't think there's one human story that suggests that okay, humans have this is an inevitable way of being and relating to the rest of nature, because there's just so much heterogeneity within humans, past and present, around our relationship to the rest of nature.
Yeah, I like that. So we don't have a definition of success when people say humans have been exceptionally successful.
Yeah.
We have been here only for a short period of time, as you say, 100,000, 200,000 years. And so it is unclear
Yeah.
how long we will be here. I mean, we've been at the brink many times before. I think there was a bottleneck of Homo sapiens that had only about 15,000 samples left at some point.
Yeah.
And so we might have gotten just lucky. So luck might be the definition
Yeah.
why we are here. But we
Yeah.
read too much into it, I think.
Yeah, that I haven't thought of it that way, but I like that point too. That much of what has happened that has led to this moment has been, out of our control, and then to make it all about human innovation and ingenuity is sometimes it was just, random chance. I guess I worry a little bit about that too, though, because then you don't want people to take that narrative and say, okay, well, none of it was our doing. It was all just fate and circumstances, right? So I think people will do with either sort of narrative what they want to do with it.
And yeah, so you talk about, in the first chapter, you talk about the pandemic a little bit. And so again, so we go through this brings of, I don't know what the right term is, evolution.
Yeah.
But we seem to pull through it. Whether it's luck or whether it is some skilled talent, it's unclear. But there has been many instances when humans pull through what appeared to be a very, very difficult discontinuity, right? So I guess there are two things here. So if you're really superior, let's say, if humans are really superior, they would have understood their environment a lot better, I would argue. And so superiority in this context is more of an internally focused thing, not externally focused, because we managed to really destroy the environment in 100,000 years, right? And so we don't seem to really understand the system that well. But on the other hand, I don't know if you talk about this. I mean, our horizons are pretty limited,
Yeah.
70, 80, 90 years. So for the individual subjective function would likely never extend to sort of a societal function. And so, yeah, we are local optimizers, I would say. Would you think that?
Well, if what you're getting at, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but if what you're getting at is kind of the evolved psychological limitations that humans have to understanding large, like collective action problems like climate change, there has been work looking across human cultures that really challenges the narrative that humans are somehow ill-equipped to deal psychologically with the long time frames of climate change and maybe the global versus local focus. But
Yeah.
because again, there's just so much variation within human cultures around how we relate to the environment, around how we make decisions about climate change, right? I mean, we know that the people who are the least responsible for the ecological crisis are also the ones who are the most at risk of its consequences. And similarly, to sort of say that climate inaction is just a human problem as opposed to a cultural one, I think overlooks all of this important cultural variation in responses to the environmental crisis. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, and that's true. So yeah, that's also true. So we got 200 countries, 8 billion people. And as you say, there is significant diversity among them, significant cultural, even societal structure,
Yeah.
organization. So there's significant variety. So when we lump 8 billion people into a bucket and say that is Homo sapien bucket,
Yeah.
we are missing something, right?
Totally. And I feel I have to be careful about when I talk about the arrogant ape, right? Because the arrogant ape, it sounds like I'm making a claim about a species, right? That humans are the arrogant ape. And as I clarify in the first chapter of the book, the arrogant ape is neither a species, nor even a particular culture, nor even a particular individual. I see the arrogant ape as a kind of role or character, like a protagonist in a Greek tragedy that is blinded
Mhm.
by their own hubris, right? It's a cultural narrative of
Yeah.
human exceptionalism that many people have subscribed to, often unknowingly, but it's by no means a human universal worldview or way of being.
Mhm. So the chapter 2 is the unlearning curve. And you start with, sort of talking about your childhood.
Mhm.
So what do you mean by the unlearning curve?
Yeah. So one thing that I make clear in the second chapter is that human exceptionalism is an ideology that is not necessarily explicitly taught to us. I mean, some
Mhm.
people, maybe it's taught to them, people go up to the chalkboard and say, put humans at the top of some hierarchy or pyramid of life, but that is rarely how human exceptionalism
Mhm.
is taught. Typically, it's something that we learn and internalize as we grow up in a culture that does categorically really prioritize the interests of humans over
Mhm.
other forms of life. And, I to kind of connect this to the first chapter,
Mhm.
I am really interested in the ways in which human exceptionalism, unlike the other causes of the ecological crisis, often operates in this invisible way. It's like it's everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's so normalized and internalized in our society that people don't question it or name
Mhm.
it or scrutinize it. And in this way, I think it actually derives a lot of power from the fact that it's invisible. Uh,
Mhm.
and the unlearning curve suggests, though, that once you make it visible, once you start to interrogate it and challenge it, you really start to see how pervasive this ideology is, not
Mhm.
just in our, schools and textbooks, in our, religious sermons, political campaigns, media, movies, and our language, but also in our sciences. And once you start to
Mhm.
recognize how infiltrated and entrenched this ideology is in so many aspects of our culture, you start to see it everywhere. It becomes impossible to unsee. And
Mhm.
that's why I call it an unlearning curve, because once you're on it and once the veil of human exceptionalism has been
Mhm.
lifted, you really start to see it in so many sectors of our society.
Mhm. Yeah. So we talked about the cultural differences, and so I grew up in India.
Yeah,
Certain religions um, do not really prioritize the human as something special.
yeah,
At least I didn't used to. I think modern technology and development are
yeah,
pushing all religions to go in a different direction, I think.
yeah,
Um, and so there's variation. But I found this very interesting. So you say here researchers found that children were considerably less likely than adults to prioritize humans over other animals. Children often opted to have multiple dogs over one human, with many valuing the life of a dog as much as that of a human. Yeah, so this has a lot of interesting thing. I mean, we have autonomous driving going on, and we have this utility function that economists debate quite a bit. And the answer sort of becomes sort of deterministic. So if the car is going to kill a dog as opposed to a human, the answer is pretty clear where the
um,
car should move.
yeah,
Uh, and it is interesting that children actually have to develop this over
yeah,
time.
yeah, right. Oh, that's yeah. So the studies you're referring to, there's been a number of these studies in developmental psychology that look at that compare how children and adults respond to like moral dilemma scenarios similar to the ones that you're describing with these autonomous vehicles, right? Where if you have
Yeah.
to choose which life to take or which life to save, who do you prioritize, humans over other species? And the study that you were referring to was done on American children and
Yeah.
adults. And it has been replicated now in, I think, a couple of European countries. And yeah, indeed, they give children and adults these moral dilemmas. So there are two sinking ships with
Mhm.
varying numbers of human or other animal passengers, and participants had to choose which ship they were going to save, and they were told that none of the passengers could swim. And there was also a third option not to decide. And yeah,
Mhm.
whereas children most often would prioritize, or sorry, whereas adults kind of across the board would prioritize saving the ship that contained human passengers, right? Even if there were like 100 dogs or pigs, they would
Mhm.
choose to save the ship that had one human passenger over a ship that had 100 dogs or pigs.
Mhm.
Children didn't have those same kinds of moral priorities, and so they would choose to save two dogs over one human. And many, as you said, valued the life of a dog as much as the life of a human. And the researchers interpreted these findings uh, through this notion of enculturation, that as the children in the study were 5 to 9 years old, as they grow up in a culture dominated by anthropocentric values and come to
Mhm.
see and learn and internalize and normalize all of the ways in which humans use and exploit other animals in our society, only then do they start to privilege humans over other species in this way. But it's not necessarily the culture, the worldview that we come into the world. It's not necessarily the lens we come into the world wearing. Rather, it's one that is heavily informed by our cultural experiences.
And education. So
Yeah.
so it's sort of a learned behavior is what you're arguing. The act of, I think you call it turning away,
Mm,
is something that happens over time to kids, and they are sort of instructed to do that, right?
yeah.
So this is what I call local optimization. So, over time, you say, I'm going to do the best thing for me. I'm going to do the best thing for my house or my parents. And then I'm going to do the best thing for my community and so on and so forth. So there's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And at some point, everything outside that hierarchy, you turn away from it because
Mm,
it's sort of not your problem in the sense that, I think this is what kids are learning over time. I wondered, did you do any sort of comparative study, let's say Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland, something like that? These are small countries, fairly unified cultures. And I
yeah.
wondered if you find something different there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not aware of this research being done in Scandinavian countries. I think the other two cultures I was referring to were in Spain and Poland, respectively. But yeah, this act of like turning away, and I see it as a form of desensitization that happens, right? Where you're exposed to all of this cruelty towards
Hmm.
other animals in our society, and even as a means of coping, right? Our caregivers will tell us, well, don't think about that, don't worry about that, or they'll rationalize it in some way. Oh, they're not feeling that much pain, or there's nothing that we can do about it. Don't trouble yourself too much with this, right? We are, maybe many of us are used to these kinds of justifications or rationalizations. And I think what I was really interested in chapter two was the way that those systems of ethical desensitization also operate within science itself, because so many
Hmm.
kids get into science because they love the living world, they love nature, they love other animals, but then they find themselves dissecting frogs or asphyxiating,
Hmm.
bugs for their bug collections, or doing really bad things to other animals. And those things are sort of seen as a rite of passage to enter into the scientific community,
Hmm.
um, when actually there's many alternatives now, especially for the same pedagogical
Hmm.
outcomes. If you want to learn about anatomy or something, there are other ways of doing this that don't necessarily involve harming or killing other, or the using other animals who have been killed in the name of science. And so, yeah, I think this sort of turning away, this ethical desensitization starts from a young age, including in sort of conventional scientific curricula.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I did some work in the pharmaceutical industry, and as you know, there is a lot of toxicology tests
Yeah.
being conducted on animals before the drug goes into humans. Often we don't find very high correlations between animal models and human models, but whatever FDA has laid down as something that companies have to do.
Yeah.
But I think you talk about this maybe in a different chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Animals in captivity are different models compared to animals in the wild.
Yeah.
So the data that we are picking up might be quite noisy in that context, right?
Yeah, right. So I think there's this long-standing assumption, both in kind of biomedical research and in my own field as a primatologist, that by studying animals in these captive environments where you have total control over their environments, right? You're kind of
Mm,
getting rid of noise that could potentially tamper with your data. So you're able to really refine things and study the particular variable that you're interested in because you're removing all of this noise. But actually, more and more research is challenging what that is called the standardization fallacy. This kind of idea that you're actually making your data more reliable by trying to control everything all the time. And particularly for other primates, I would say the same is true for rodents who are highly social, intelligent,
mm,
sentient beings. Keeping them in deprived physical and social environments, which I would say most, if not all, forms of captivity are, right? They're kept in tiny cages, which are very
mm,
small percentages of their natural home ranges. In my work as a primatologist, when you're doing studies that compare the cognitive abilities of humans and great apes, often the apes are separated from the group during the study. They're often separated from their biological mothers at birth, right? And you're assuming that this sample is representative of the general population of chimpanzees, when of course
mm,
they are not at all, right? And then
mhm,
in the case of comparative cognition research, where you're comparing the cognitive abilities of humans and other species side by side, typically humans and our closest living primate relatives, you're comparing the cognitive abilities of these captive great apes who are living in highly restricted, man-made environments,
mm,
um, separated from the group, playing with human toys, involving a human experimenter, with the cognitive abilities of typically, let's say a American or Western, human children sitting on
mm.
their parents' laps who are relatively autonomous. They go home many of the times, to their family after the study. And these are not, neither one of these are representative of the populations they purport to represent, right? The chimpanzees
Mm.
are highly unrepresentative of chimpanzees, though humans are highly unrepresentative of humans on the whole. And yet these are often used to make claims about humans' cognitive uniqueness. And it's just, they're not representative, or
Mm.
they're not they're not representative samples, and it's an invalid comparison.
Yeah, so chapter 3, you say a compulsion to contrast. You say here from Aristotle to the Bible, from the Enlightenment to Marx, the idea of the human as a superior animal or a being that is different from an animal altogether permeates Western thought. There has been no shortage of qualities, you say here, put forward to justify this claim: rationality, language, tool use, culture, innovation, morality, consciousness. Of that list, what I find to be the differentiating technology is language,
Mm.
because rationality, tool use potentially, rationality, culture, innovation, morality, consciousness are things that we can't really measure that well, but language we can. And as far as we know, Homo sapiens are the only ones who have a very structured, extensive language tool. Maybe not for long, because we got this large language models. after after a few years, we will lose language as a human skill potentially. So language, I think, allowed us to think about the superiority thing. So we can go out there and say, look, I can explain things to you. I will not do anything about it, but I can talk the whole day about something without knowing
Mhm.
anything about. So we really strategically use language to position ourselves as something superior, I think. That's a hypothesis.
Right. Yeah. So this compulsion to contrast, right? All of these characteristics that have been put forward as the cognitive Rubicon that separates human from animal have systematically been debunked over time, right? Through
Mhm.
looking at what other animals are capable of and complex cultures and tool use, just being two of them. The language question, I think a journalist in the New York Times, Ferris Jaber, he writes that language is the last bastion encircling human exceptionalism, right? And it's kind of consistent with what you're saying that okay, this must be that holy grail, right? This must be the trait that differentiates us. And a lot of it comes down to how we're defining language.
Yeah,
And again,
yeah.
I want to come back to an earlier point that I made, which is I'm not wholly opposed to the notion that humans have unique characteristics that differentiate them, and maybe human language is one of those characteristics. But it's worth noting that many of these criteria that we thought that how we defined language
Mhm.
in, as being exceptional, for instance, like only humans have syntax, or only humans have recursive structures, or only humans have grammar, have
Yeah.
been documented in other animals. So prairie dogs are like a great example of
Mhm.
an animal who they can describe novel objects. They communicate with one another. They could say if a human in a blue shirt is walking towards them,
Mhm.
they can describe it to that level of specificity. So again, it comes down to like what features are we using
Mhm.
to say that human language is unique. Other
Mhm.
species have incredibly complex forms of communication, and I would say languages in their own right. It's
Mhm.
just what metrics are we using? How are we defining language? Maybe they don't have human language. Maybe they have other kinds of languages, other forms of grammar and syntax that don't
Yeah.
look like ours.
Yeah.
Um, so it depends on what metric we're using, and I'll leave it at that. But we'll just make one last point about the sort of history of human exceptionalism, going back to Aristotle's Scala Naturae, this
Mhm.
scale of life that positioned humans at the top and ranked all other species below, which was eventually incorporated into the Great Chain of Being and the Judeo-Christian tradition,
Mhm.
has many uh, articulations in Enlightenment philosophy and science. And one of those proponents being Rene Descartes, who argued that what makes humans exceptional is that we have language and therefore are rational. So that notion that language is the distinguishing feature has a
Mhm.
long history, and I think what I was really interested in the book was sort of troubling some of the assumptions we make about language being human unique.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, because we don't know other languages, other animals' communication
Yeah,
processes, it's quite possible that what we do is not necessarily very optimum. You know, like English is a good example of this.
yeah,
Spelling, the grammatical structures are very ambiguous sometimes.
yeah.
So maybe there are much simpler way to communicate than language, which we cannot get to, right? We don't have access to that.
Totally. And we call it body language for a reason, because there's an incredible richness of information in how we move our bodies and our facial expressions that, yeah, I would say other animals are more attuned to
Mhm.
sometimes. And but it's a sometimes an even more reliable form of communication than
Mhm.
language, right? Because we can deceive and derail a lot of conversations through or communications through language. But yeah, perhaps there's more integrity in these other forms of communication.
Yeah, my thought experiment, the thought going through my mind is if an extraterrestrial came here and put humans in cages,
Mm.
and let them communicate with each other, they're going to sit back and say, what are these guys doing? I mean, it seems
Yeah.
too complex.
Right. I
Yeah.
completely agree. And to your point about like just, other animals could be using all of these cues that are more efficient or, just not cues that we're using. I do a thought experiment in the book. I think it's in chapter 5, but where I'm like wondering about whether birds, when they communicate with one another, because they are moving in this like aerodynamic,
Yeah.
environment, and they're constantly at different vantage points from the other. Like what if the meaning of what they say depends on whether one is here versus here, or
Mm.
further apart or closer together? Or what if the meaning of what they're saying depends on the direction of the wind or the orientation of the sun, or whether it's morning or evening? And I
Mhm.
think to some extent this is also true of humans. Like if you say the same word in different contexts, it can mean totally different things. But I think we're
Yeah.
often not taking that broader context seriously enough when we study whether other species have language. We're like
Mhm.
looking at whether, we're using these large language models now to try to decode whale song and communication. And it's like, but are we taking all the variables possible that could inform or influence what they're saying?
Mhm.
I don't think that we could possibly do that, but it doesn't mean that their languages are lacking or less sophisticated. It just means we're not sophisticated enough to understand them.
Yeah, so it's our tendency, I think, with computers and large language models and other things, is to take emotion out of the language. So we are always trying to get to an engineering view or
Mm,
technology view of language, right? So yeah, I mean, you can feed some machine a lot of bird songs, and it can probably structure it, come up with some interesting way to do it, but
yeah.
it will miss a lot of things, right? Because you don't have emotions in there. You just have data.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, unless you have data on the history of the interactions between those two birds, what is their relationship? Are they mates? Is it, a parent and a child? Are they friends? Are they foes? What is the
Hmm.
relationship? Then the meaning of what they say is going to look very different unless you have that broader like tapestry of who they are and how they relate to each other. So I
Hmm.
agree, in addition to emotion, those sort of historical variables are often missing from those models, and therefore our attempts to actually succeed at, decoding these things are not going to uh, be as successful.
Yeah, so see here, Darwin's book, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, Darwin elaborated on his understanding that if physical traits are evolutionarily continuous, then so too are thinking and feeling. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So Darwin's theory of natural selection, really challenged dominant notions of human exceptionalism because it suggested that humans and all species stem from common origins, right? And that differences between species are a matter of degree and not kind. And that pertain not just to physical characteristics, but also to
Mm.
psychological characteristics. And so there's a continuity, not just in our bodies, but also in our minds and how we feel and think.
Mm.
And I really, what I'd like to do is introduce a helpful distinction, because I think as scientists, I was taught that, okay, if we're making claims about, let's say, an animal's mental life, maybe we're not being very good scientists, right? Because it's all subjective and we
Mm.
can't really know for sure because we can't totally observe it as clearly as other behaviors. But and so there's this assumption that when we're talking about minds and mental continuity among species, that somehow we're not being great scientists, and that is related to this broader striving towards parsimony in science. Like we want to have the simplest that we observe. And what my mentor Franz de Waal did was he introduced this kind of counter. So what I was talking about before was people would criticize people for being anthropomorphic, right? You don't want
Mm.
to introduce these psychological explanations when you don't have to, because that would be anthropomorphic. And what Franz de Waal did is he said, What about anthropo-denial? What about the tendency to deny that mental continuity and similarities between species when in fact it does exist? And what he argued was that sometimes, it's a very Darwinian argument, assuming mental continuity between species is the most parsimonious explanation. That from an evolutionary standpoint, from a Darwinian standpoint, it is the most straightforward, parsimonious, simple explanation to assume that if another animal is acting like they're in pain, and looks like they're in pain and screaming out and rubbing the affected area, that they are in pain, that would actually be the simplest and most evolutionarily parsimonious explanation, drawing back to Darwin's point that continuity exists both for bodily form and psychological makeup.
Yeah, so I don't know why science finds it difficult. I don't know if science is finding it difficult because, I mean, over time the brains got more complex, but it all starts from something smaller and something simpler.
Mm.
So, yeah, as you say, the easiest explanation would be to say, yeah, it's a continuous function.
Yeah.
If you look backward, you might see some discontinuities in there, but it is not fundamentally changing the structure of evolution, right?
Right. There's not like a categorical difference. And all species today are alive today are equally evolved. There's no hierarchy of more or less intelligent, right? It's all species have evolved their own intelligences to fulfill a certain ecological niche. So yeah, the sort of notion of like over time, just things getting more and more complex, and then there was this categorical leap
Hmm.
to human brains or human minds. It's not an evolutionarily sound story. Um,
Mhm. Yes, let me ask you this. I don't know if you talk about this or not. So consciousness nowadays is a big thing.
yeah.
Some technologists think that machines are getting conscious, but we don't have a definition for consciousness. But I have heard people say only humans are conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so where do you stand on this idea of consciousness?
Yeah, so a very elusive concept that is notoriously hard to define. The way I define it in the book is the way that many philosophers and scientists define it today, which is that an entity is conscious if there is something that it's like to be that entity. So if there
Hmm.
is a subjective experience there. And I mean, there's been a ton of studies now on other animals and whether other animals are conscious, as is often the case, starting with, those animals who resemble us and we
Hmm.
can identify with, like other primates and mammals, but increasingly work on conscious states in crustaceans and in fishes and insects, right? And my approach to the study of consciousness is that even though it's very hard to pin down from an evolutionary function standpoint, like what is the function of consciousness? Why should we have it? And therefore
Hmm.
kind of understand its evolutionary trajectory. I follow a precautionary principle where if we deny other entities, other beings consciousness when in fact they are conscious and can experience positive and negative states,
Hmm.
then that is a greater moral mistake or concern than assuming that more entities are conscious than in
Hmm.
actuality, right? And so I think if there, and I'm drawing on the work of my colleague here at NYU, Jeff Sebo, if there's like a non-negligible chance that an entity is conscious, I think
Hmm.
we should take seriously their welfare interests and be talking about it. And so I don't really draw lines
Hmm.
necessarily because I think we don't understand consciousness very well at all. There's so many different theories for how consciousness arises, and we still haven't managed to figure out how the brain or how physical substrates like the body give rise to qualitative conscious, states like consciousness and experiences. So I try to adopt a position of like real humility around consciousness because I don't even think I fully understand like my own consciousness. It's such an abstract and difficult phenomenon to study.
Yeah.
And from the animals, for instance, who have been studied, the evidence seems pretty clear to me that if we're going to say humans are conscious on those same sort of
Yeah.
metrics, then they certainly are conscious as well.
I think the reason we are having too much difficulty, both in a definitional perspective as well as measuring it, is that we are taking a reductionist approach to consciousness.
Yeah.
Consciousness may not be reducible. We can solve any engineering problems, but sometimes if it is not amenable to reductionism, we don't understand it. The other issue I think is that I think you talked about this. There is quite a bit of variability. So suppose I take two models,
Mm.
maybe same species, can take two humans, for instance, and expose them to a scenario or something. The subjective experience, as you say, these two models will experience are going to be quite different.
Mm.
So it's not like I can write down an equation to say if I give you x and y, you will always get c prime. It's
Yeah.
not the case. It depends on the entity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue that even within the same entity, the same individual, like is my subjective experience of, I don't know, whatever, let's say blueberries, of a flavor, a taste, the same yesterday as it
Mm,
is today, as it will be tomorrow. Like it's an elusive concept, within and between individuals. And another point that I think is really important to make is that uh, we often think that like consciousness is all in the brain, right? And that if you don't have a brain or you have a very simple brain, then you cannot be very conscious. But evolution has told us over and over again that different forms have evolved to solve different functions. And so,
mm,
um, I mean, many fish don't have lungs, right? But they
mm,
manage to breathe. They exchange gases with the environment, and so do trees. And um, you know, other many crustaceans don't have a visual cortex, but they still manage to see, right? And so if we just take what human consciousness and how we think it works, which I agree, it can't be reduced.
mm,
But people try, and if we take those data points as like the blueprint for what consciousness should be, then we're
mm,
overlooking the possibility that it can arise in many different ways, in many different structures, through many different means. And so
mm.
again, it's another version of the sort of reductionist approach. We have to like take a more holistic approach to this very elusive concept that we don't understand so well.
Yeah, it might be good to get humans a little bit more humble. If you can find a definition for what appears to define you in many ways, that is problematic.
Right.
Um, and the idea that machines, we can, our invention, the machines we're going to make them conscious. I think you talk about, so it's sort of the superiority complex principle, which is I know all about this, and I'm going to make that thing
Mm,
conscious,
yeah.
even though I cannot tell you what consciousness is. But
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah. No, that's a good point, and that I can't even understand it myself, and we can't really understand it in the living world. I mean, that's sort of where I actually don't write much about AI at all in the book because it just felt like this really complex and huge topic that if I went into it, I would like need a whole other book, right? But it does strike me as interesting how many of the debates, right, around like
mm,
whether other entities can be conscious or intelligent, right? We have this phrase like artificial intelligence,
mm,
uh, the, or language, all of these traits that sometimes we hesitate to use with other animals. We're a little bit less hesitant to apply it to our technologies that we've made, right?
yeah,
That this is language. No, this is actually language. This is maybe an artificial form, but we can still call it, intelligence, and that they are maybe sentient and conscious. It's like we still haven't figured this out for the rest of the living world,
mm,
and and that to me is interesting. It's like maybe we should focus
mm.
on resolving some of those debates first.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of human centrism. So in some sense, I haven't really thought about this, but in some sense, what we're arguing is that language defines us. And if I make a large language model, as they call it, that is intelligence, because we use language, and if machines start to use it, they will be intelligent too.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe it is just a missed idea, I think. I mean, I look at language as a tool. I think of LLMs as stochastic parrots.
Yeah,
You feed a lot of history into it, it can come up with something interesting.
yeah,
But I don't see any intelligence in this. I know that this is not your focus, but
yeah,
it's sort
yeah.
of related to how humans are looking at our skills, our abilities, our superiority, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's interesting to hear you think about language as a tool. I think perhaps in a similar way, I think of language as a behavior. It's
Hmm.
like it we have this assumption that because people can tell you how they feel, that that gives you a direct window or direct access into their consciousness, into their subjective experience. That because I can tell you, oh, I'm stressed or I'm tired, that somehow now you know with absolute certainty what it is that I'm feeling. But as you were
Hmm.
saying before, like, what am I being honest when I'm saying that? Is my subjective experience of stress and fatigue the same as yours? So it's language is just another indirect form of evidence
Yeah.
for subjective states like consciousness. And there are so many other indirect forms of evidence, right? Like body language or facial expressions.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think it's just again, it's like these other like facial expressions and body language and the way I'm moving my hands right now and the way that I'm looking. Language is another behavior. Again, it's measurable, it's
Hmm.
quantifiable, like these other, it's not, some like I think similar to what you're saying, like some direct route into our minds. It's not
Hmm.
some form of our intelligence. It's just a behavior, and it's just a tool that we can use in addition to these other tools and behaviors at our disposal.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about this, Christine. So it's also very constraining. So going back to, you're talking about birds communicating, there are a lot of environmental parameters that make that communication different.
Yeah,
Language is very constraining. As I say, the body language is, high spectrum, lot of information going through.
yeah,
Language in that sense is highly, highly restrictive. So this is why people don't really. Um, I don't have any opinion. I don't have an agenda here or an opinion.
yeah, yeah.
Companies want employees to come back to the office, and I don't know why, but part of it
Mhm.
might be that you put a group of people in a room, you get a different outcome as opposed to Zoom or Teams or just phone calls. Phone calls never do it for
Yeah,
me, actually. Yeah.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's an interesting connection. I hadn't thought, but that part of that need to actually be in the same room is so that you can actually read each other's behavior in other ways beyond just like the spoken word, right? And that you relate to people in a different way. And that makes total sense. And they have done studies about
Yeah.
how like Zoom calls and they can be so exhausting in part because our minds are like trying to extract information about all of these other cues that are typically available to us, but that
Mhm.
we can't. And so we're having a harder time like making sense of the interaction and the context because all of these other cues are absent that are also really important.
Mm. Yeah, I don't own a pet, but I have heard people, dog owners and cat owners say they can communicate with their
Mm,
pets. They know
mhm.
exactly what they're thinking, exactly how they're feeling, right? So
Yeah,
if you focus on that channel, we might be able to do it more systematically. Maybe we are not giving them enough credit. Maybe they're maybe they're
yeah,
sitting there saying, "I tried to tell you this before. You're not
yeah.
picking up what I'm trying to tell you." Yeah.
Right. And there's so many different modalities too, right? It's not just is vision and sound, but like dogs with olfactory messaging and communication and what
Yeah.
they're picking up from us in that modality too, right? It's so complicated and complex and we should acknowledge that.
So you have another chapter here, the mismeasure of all things. What do you mean?
I'm referring to the famous statement that man is the measure of all things, and I'm arguing that if we use the human prototype as the benchmark for whatever quality that we're interested in, intelligence or consciousness, then we're biasing, comparisons with other species from the start. And I basically say that, if we measure the world with a ruler made for humans, then other species will inevitably come up short. So that chapter touches on a lot of what we've been discussing so far, and like how we define these capabilities in a restrictive way. And it kind of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy if we define intelligence in a certain way that is very human-centric, then of course other species won't look intelligent because we're defining it from the get-go in a very species-specific way.
Yeah, and also we believe that that is the ceiling because we are on the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
So if you measure anything, it has to be, if our intelligence is 100, if you measure anything, it has to be less than 100.
Yeah.
If you actually get more than 100, you're going to reject that as a possibility.
Yeah, right. Well, then it's not, then it's something else is going on. It must not be very intelligent. Yeah, and there's so many different ways of defining intelligence, even within humans. So I often will ask my students in class, like, if you had to say who's more intelligent, the Dalai Lama or talking, they rightly will ask a follow-up question, like, well, how are we defining intelligence? Is it, like general intelligence or IQ? Is it emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, like creative, whatever, spatial intelligence? There's just so many different ways of defining intelligence, even within one species.
Yeah, so you talk about Irwin's law here. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, this is a law coined by the ecologist Rob Dunn, who has written a book recently about symbiosis and cooperation in the living world. I think it's called The Call of the Honey Guide. It's a great book. Anyways, he coined this term named after a beetle biologist, Terry Irwin, who at the time he was studying beetles, I don't remember what the numbers are, but there was a certain approximation of like how many different species of beetles existed on Earth. And then he went into the rainforest and did some pretty bad things to beetles, actually like fumigated some trees and all the beetles died, but then counted the number of different species that were there. And by his estimate, the number of beetles was like exponentially, different species of beetles was exponentially higher than what people had assumed to be the case at the time. And so Dunn turned this into Irwin's law, which is basically that life on Earth is far more diverse and complex than we typically understand and give credit for. And it's really a call in some ways for greater humility, because it suggests that the vast majority of species we know about are really highly unrepresentative of how many different kinds of species there are and what those species look like. And so, yeah, he's really highlighting, I guess, the limits of our scientific knowledge and how much we still have to learn about the diversity of life on Earth through that law.
Yeah, so before we head out to Mars, we might want to spend more time understanding what is out here. They say oceans are the least explored thing in the solar system, Earth's oceans.
Wow. Yeah.
We send stuff out to all the planets, satellites, and everything else, but there's so much in the oceans, for instance, that we haven't even started to explore.
Yeah, and not just, I mean, Rob Dunn's work, he focuses a lot on the microbial world, and so it's like we've studied mostly the animals and beings who look like us. And what about, the vast majority of other animals out there, let alone plants and fungi, let alone the microbial world? I think he said something like, we understand that even the microbes who are like living in human American households, we understand we've even identified a very, very small fraction of those microbes. The vast majority of them are unknown to science. It's pretty humbling insight.
Humbling, yeah. So now another chapter, thinking otherwise. So you say, what is it like to be a bat pondered the philosopher Thomas Nagel in the classic 1974 essay of the same title. In what might be the most widely cited paper in the field of philosophy of mind, Nagel wrote that the conscious experiences of other animals are inherently subjective and hard to describe. That is true. Yeah, I mean, even our conscious experiences are inherently subjective and hard to describe.
Yeah.
So what is his point?
Well,
Nagel's point.
yeah, no, again, his point was that there's sort of this like radical difference between our sensory worlds and experiences that like we could never really understand what it's like to echolocate or to fly,
Yeah.
through the air with these winged appendages. But as you said, right, it's this so-called like problem of other minds that it's impossible to really understand the subjective experience of another. Doesn't just apply across species, but it also to some extent applies within species, right? What we were saying before, that I can never know with absolute certainty what it's like to be you or another human. And so that problem of other minds is not just a problem when it comes to other species, but a problem more generally.
Yeah, it's not a solvable problem.
Yeah.
In some sense, it's a property of a biological system. And we're asking, how do I put an equation to this property?
Yeah.
That might be impossible to do, although we keep trying. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I just think all of these sort of assumed barriers to understanding the interiority or mentality of other beings is those assumptions, when you really interrogate them, tend to hold true across our own species as well. And that's been a really important realization for me in writing this book and like my scientific trajectory more generally, that we shouldn't have these double standards about what's possible across species when we haven't fully figured it out within humans either.
Yeah, it's so I think more broadly, what you're saying is that there is no discontinuity. I mean, we have an undefined number of biological systems. They all seem to have come from the same point. Things have gotten bigger over time, and there is no categorical difference among any of them. So any differentiation we bring to them is artificial in
Yes.
some ways, right?
Yeah. And I would say my experience working with other primates have really taught me that firsthand, because other primates really like straddle this supposed boundary between human and animal. And what they've taught me over and over again is never underestimate their abilities. The lines that we draw are artificial for the most part, and that there's so much continuity and so much that we can learn from the way that they do things.
Excellent. So we'll finish up with this, Christine. So you talk about here about baboons in Namibia. So you spent some time there?
Yeah, I have, in the Namib Desert. Yeah.
And what's interesting about baboons? What did you learn?
Well, I'm really interested in social behavior, and baboons are highly social, as are most primates. And I am still particularly interested in conflict and aggression, and how animals mitigate aggression and how they resolve conflicts and manage conflicts in a group setting. So I was studying baboon conflict and post-conflict behavior, and a interaction I had with a baboon, which actually I write about in the first chapter of the book, is one of these interactions that I'm referring to when I say the animals have taught me so much and have really challenged my assumptions about the supposed lines that separate humans and animals. And so maybe we can conclude with me sharing a bit more about that specific individual and interaction.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was a juvenile male baboon named Bear, and he taught me something that really challenged my assumptions about something called theory of mind. Theory of mind is like the ability to to sort of understand what others are thinking, right? To know what others know. And it has long been thought that that is a human unique ability, that only humans know what others know. And Bear, one day after a particularly scary interaction between him and a colleague who was also in the field with me, there was like a mobbing event where a bunch of baboons surrounded her, and it was pretty clear that Bear had instigated this drama, even though we weren't sure how it had happened. But it was a very scary moment where the bear and a bunch of other baboons had surrounded her, and they were slapping her legs and barking, and it was terrifying for her, especially, and for the baboons, and also for me. And then the next day, I was following the same troop of baboons when all of a sudden I see Bear make a beeline for me. He's marching right towards me. He has a whole entourage of other baboons in tow, and I'm thinking, oh God, this time I'm going to be the target of this aggression. And I got very scared. I had been keeping my distance from the troop the whole day as a result of what had happened the day before. But Bear, he kept getting closer and closer and closer to me. And finally, he came right up next to me. He put his arm in between my hiking boots, and he looked at me, and he bared his teeth into this very awkward, forced grimace. And this is a pacifying gesture that baboons give to one another to appease one another after conflicts, to make amends, and sometimes to like show subordination or benign intent. And it was very clear to me in that moment that Bear knew what I knew. Bear knew that I knew what had happened the day before, that I was afraid as a result of that interaction, and he was trying to put things right. And so not only do I believe that the simplest explanation for that interaction was that Bear had theory of mind, he knew what I knew, but he had theory of mind for a member of another species, which is incredible. And that's one of many examples in the book that I share where another animal, another individual really taught me something and taught me to be open to the possibility that these animals are capable of much more than we conventionally give them credit for.
And I don't know if I'm thinking about it correctly, Christine. So there is also a personality question.
Yeah.
So again, we cannot reduce things to something specific, right? So every animal will have a personality that is different from somebody else. So we are really looking at it in a matrix. It's not a spectrum. It's not a single dimensional spectrum. It's a matrix. And when we look at that, it could be it could be quite noisy, the data coming out, right?
Yeah, right. So we tend to talk about like baboons in general or species in general, and there is at least acknowledgement within primatology that no, okay, there's different cultures, right, within the same species, that there's different cultures of different ways of being and norms for interacting and tools that they use within the same species. But then, yeah, going even more fine grained, there are so many individual differences. And as a result of those individual differences, so many different forms of interaction that are possible when two personalities meet, right? And I think the more we can highlight that complexity, the better our science will be, right? Because again, it's not trying to like get rid of all this noise and control it all, but it's attempting to work with it and understand it and acknowledge that it's present. And I think our lives will be all the richer for it too, because it means, as my colleague and mentor Barbara Smuts would say, that there's just recognizing the individuality of other beings means there's endless relationships that are possible of all kinds and of all forms, and that's a really, I think, beautiful recognition.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks for spending time with me, Christine. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.